Hello, I'm going to run through the three basic settings that are on your camera. The three basic settings on your camera are the ISO, shutter speed and aperture. So let's just take a picture and show you exactly how these affect the image. Here's a picture of a wooden plane. Now let's start with the ISO. ISO is basically how sensitive the sensor is in your camera, or how sensitive the film was back in the day. This means the higher the number, the brighter the image would be, or the more light that's going to be let into the image. ISO is its standard, so it'll be starting at 100 and then it goes up a stop of light, which is basically twice as much light, would be 200 and then 400, 800, 1600, 3200 and even 6400 if you're really going to go push it that far. At higher ISOs there'll be more noise introduced into the image, and this is because in a digital camera it is given more of a charge, so it becomes more sensitive, which actually ends up showing the imperfections that are in the sensor, which is why you get a lot of noise in images sometimes. So now I'll show you if you go up a stop of light. So this shot was done at 200 and then this will go up to 400 now. You'll notice the image gets brighter. Then if we go down a stop from there, we go back down to 200 and then we go back down another stop to 100, you'll notice the image gets darker. So that's how ISO affects your image. Next, moving away from the sensor, you have the shutter. This is basically how long the sensor is exposed to the light. The faster the shutter speed, the less motion blur that there'll be in the image. So if you have a shutter speed of 8,000th of a second, there'll be very little. But if you then drop that right down and go from like a 50th of a second and it's a sports car going past you, you will just get a blurry mess. And then if you do anything that's like 1 second or 30 seconds or even a couple of minutes, you can do, that's called long exposure photography, and that's when you have something that's stationary in the shot usually, and it's got things that are moving, so either people or water, and this just allows you to get a different dynamic and different kind of image than you would normally if you were to just take a snapshot of it on your phone. In gig photography specifically, it's always a trade-off of how much light can you get into the photo and how much blurriness you want in the image, or how much motion blur you want in there. So I often try and get at least 200th of a second, just because then I know that they're going to be pretty still depending on who it is, but most musicians it'll be pretty still. There might be a bit of motion blur if they're playing the guitar or if they're jumping about, but anything really slower than this and you'll notice that the photo isn't quite tack sharp. Now I stupidly took photos at a different shutter speed but with nothing moving in the image, so all it is a proof of the longer the exposure, the brighter the image. That's not really useful, is it, for anyone? But basically, if it was a longer exposure, the more motion blur you would have in the image. So if it's a very relatively still shot, then you won't really see any motion blur, even if you went to a 50th of a second. But again, if it was a football match or if it was racing cars going past, you would notice the motion blur of them going past because they go traveling quite fast across. Moving on to the lens where the aperture is. This is made up of a system of blades that open and close to a certain amount. Basically, the wider it is, the more light that is going to be going into the image and the brighter it will be. And then obviously if you have it a narrower one, it will then have less light in it and it'll be a darker image overall. Aperture also affects the depth of field, so how much of an image is in focus at any one time. So say if it was at 2.8 like this lens can do, then very little of me would be in focus. It would probably be just my eyes if the camera was a bit closer. Whereas if you start going to 5.6 or 7.1 I think it is, then you would notice a lot more of me is in focus. An aperture of 2.8 signifies the diameter of the aperture in comparison to the rest of the lens. So it means that it would go in 2.8 times. This means actually a lower number is wider and a higher number like f22 would be a much smaller aperture. A wider aperture will draw the attention away from any distracting objects in the background or the foreground and really concentrate on the subject in hand. If there's a guitarist and say there's an ugly backdrop of whatever it is that you're playing in, it would then just blur into the background and you wouldn't really be able to tell what it is, which can be quite handy at times, especially if you don't have the best kind of scene. Now if you did a narrow aperture, this would be helpful in, say, landscape photography where you wanted something that's in the foreground to be in focus as well as the mountains behind. Now you'll see on the image of this plane how the aperture is affected. If we go up one stop, so twice as much light coming into the image, you'll notice that it gets a shallower depth of field. And if we then go down, back down to the original and then back down one more stop, you'll notice how there's more in focus but the image is slightly darker. Now it's important to know these three settings because they can compensate for the other ones. So if you wanted a bigger depth of field in your image but then you needed to get light from somewhere else because the image was too dark, you might be able to bump up the ISO. And it's just really helpful to know how these will affect your image. I'd recommend just having a play around and seeing how you get on with it and just learning about it from your own experience. So yeah, just play around with the ISO, the shutter speed and the aperture and just see how it really affects the image and just take it to the extremes just to find out where you're comfortable and where your camera can go to. So for instance, I know that I'm not going to take my camera any further than 6400 in the ISO because after that it's basically unusable. There's just too much noise in the image at that point. So go out and just have fun and shoot.